I hope everyone's having a good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about framing. So in its simplest form, framing refers to how an idea is presented or how it's thought and talked about. Framing is present in our thoughts and in our speech, in our media, in our legal system, in politics, in culture, and in all forms of dialogue and communication. It can be very subtle, and it can also be invisible. So why do we want to talk about framing and make it visible and how it relates to our work with children and families? The way that issues are framed guides the creation of the social policies that regulate all of our work. Our professional codes of ethics, our organizational mandates, and even our own personal perspectives about our work are all built on what we as individuals and organizations think and believe about our professional roles. So I imagine framing as the word scaffolding that supports our thoughts and beliefs and how we perceive and react to the world. When we examine information and how it is presented, by looking critically at how it's framed, we can start to wonder to ourselves about who is presenting the information in this way and why. If we look carefully and closely at how facts or knowledge or news are framed, we can see how some things that are presented as very simple truth are in fact biased. Sometimes we only hear about part of the story, sometimes we only hear from a few select voices, or sometimes this information is framed by people who have a very strong desire for us to think about this topic in this way. Framing is a way that people can exert power by shaping the way that topics are understood throughout society. It's so powerful because of its invisibility and because of the way that statements and thoughts are used so freely and commonly that they'll start to be taken for granted. So let's look at some different kinds of framing. Like we said, framing is crucial in politics and in the creation of social policy, which is very important for this course. As an example, in 2006, the Harper government created the Universal Child Care Benefit, which provides $100 per month for families with a child up to age 6. So one way that this was framed was on the Prime Minister's website, and it says, "We have delivered real results for Canadian families. We began by introducing the Universal Child Care Benefit, which gives families real choice in childcare. Mom and dad are the best judge of what is right for their kids, and with the benefit, parents have the option to choose the right fit for their family." The same issue has been framed in the media like this by the Public Service Alliance of Canada. The federal government also showed its contempt for Canadian families today by putting more money towards a benefit that does nothing to increase access to affordable childcare. The so-called Universal Childcare Benefit was implemented in 2006, right after the Conservatives were elected, and promptly destroyed the beginnings of a national childcare system. So let's look closely at these different pieces of communication and look for the scaffolding, the discursive framework that presents them in different lights. So if I were to look out at the first statement and highlight some things that stood out for me as possessing power in persuasion or presentation, and there's some alliteration, I might highlight how this presentation aims to persuade that this benefit empowers families, which is presented as obviously a good thing. It focuses on the family, supports the idea of family values, and it also supports the goodness and the rightness of the nuclear family. It says that families have choice. So some of the things that are assumptions that aren't stated are that there exist childcare spaces for families to make their choices between. It's also assumed that this money that they're giving is sufficient for all families to make this choice, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're marginalized or whether they're part of the 1%. Another assumption is that there exist enough jobs for mom and dad to decide if they want to work or if they want to stay home. There's also the heteronormative and often Euro-Western assumption that the normal or ideal family is a male and female mother-father dyad, which excludes homosexual parents or single-parent families, alternative families. And it also says by saying that mom and dad are the best judge, that children's voices, preferences, and rights are unimportant. And it also ignores multi-generational families where elders' voices and traditions matter deeply. So the next statement, the Public Service Alliance one, appeals to emotion and to anger by using words like contempt and using sarcasm with so-called. The assumptions are that the government is a malevolent force that seeks to disempower Canadians. It says that the government's attempt to create choice is useless. And by saying affordable childcare, it highlights that there is unaffordable childcare now. And it also leads us to believe that the best system of childcare in Canada is a national childcare system. Or another example of framing. So for the first assignment, we're choosing topics that we want to learn about throughout this course. So the social justice topic that I chose was the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the Canadian child welfare system. I wanted to understand more about how it's possible that Canada is still continuing its violent oppression of Indigenous peoples. And if we pause and think for a moment about what I just said, we can hear how I framed my belief about the topic. I could have said that I wanted to understand more about how Canada is protecting the safety and well-being of Indigenous children through the child welfare system. So there's some quick bias of my own coming through there in my discursive framing. So when I was writing my paper, I took two articles, the mainstream news one and the independent article, and I went through them slowly and carefully. And I was circling words and making notes about things that were giving the article a slant. I took notes on how the article was reflecting the desires and the goals of the person or the organizations that had written them, what political affiliations were evident in the article, how did the author or media outlet give emotion to the article, what was the article trying to get me to think, or what was it get me to try and believe? And very importantly, I tried to look between the lines for what the article was not saying. So we need to look at the words and remember that they're single biased perspectives and that they're not simple truths. And they're woven through with invisible assumptions that we can try and pick out. So I had an article from the Times Colonist, and I saw or interpreted that the discourse in the article was perpetuating a stereotype that people who are marginalized are at fault for their own marginalization. There was an assumption that it's individual weakness or badness that creates situations of risk and unsafety, and that systems or policies or institutions are not at fault for this. The problem was located within the people, and it isolated the families for being inherently violent or inherently sick. There was also a discourse of rescue that could be seen, a racist discourse of powerful white male politicians who would champion for Indigenous children's, which erased and negated the strengths and abilities of Indigenous communities to know what's right and what's best. And I could find evidence of a neoliberal political ideology. In the independent news source that I had, the article focused on the societal inequalities that create the situations in which child neglect is inevitable because of inadequate funding and resources, inaccessible supports, or exclusionary and fundamentally racist colonial systems of control. So in the two articles, there were very different frames that led the reader to make different conclusions about race, power, strengths, and responsibility. I saw evidence of a social democratic political ideology. And the 2006 Ismail article that's on the reading list, it's another really good example of how child poverty is framed. Earlier, I said that framing is often invisible. So we can become more powerful by finding and making framing visible and talking about what other perspectives have been silenced. if you take a look around, you'll see those invisible word scaffolds everywhere in statements that are so ubiquitous that we don't even think about them anymore. Like the war on terror, or only $1 a day will make a difference in the life of an African child, or third world aid, or developing countries and first world countries, or 10 quick tips for a flatter stomach, or normal development, or the at-risk family, or vulnerable populations, or expert knowledge. So take a look at your articles and look for what assumptions, values, and systems of control you can see and hear in how they're framed. I hope this was helpful. Have a great day.